In today's video, I'm going to show you how to create this React Select component entirely in TypeScript, and it's supporting single select, multi-select, and keyboard accessibility. And best of all is we're writing the entire thing completely from scratch, so you can really deep dive into how this component works. This is going to be an intermediate level project, but it's a super fun one and looks amazing on resumes. Building out even a simple authentication system is incredibly complex because as soon as you want to start adding things like two-factor authentication, multiple tenant systems, single sign-on, and so on, it becomes astronomically difficult to manage and make sure everything works together, which is why I highly recommend using PropelAuth, today's video sponsor. They specialize in authentication, and the best part is they make it very easy to set up. With just a couple lines of code, you can be set up with an entire workflow of authentication that includes all of these complex features, as well as a backend where you can manage all of your different users and organizations that have signed up. I just really love that PropelAuth comes with everything out of the box and is so easy to set up. So if you're looking for an easy to set up authentication system that's also incredibly robust, I highly recommend checking out PropelAuth, which is going to be linked down in the description below. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And in this video, we're going to be creating these React Select components that you can see over here. Now to get started, I've actually created a Vite application, or Vite as it's pronounced, instead of creating the normal Create React app. And to do that, all you need to do is run npm create Vite, and then you just need to select that you want to use React as well as TypeScript if you want to follow on exactly with this tutorial. Then I installed the dependencies and ran our application, and this on the right-hand side of our screen is what we get. Now first, I just want to go into the source folder. I'm going to remove this app.css. Inside of here, I'm going to remove essentially all of the code, and I'm just going to return null, or I'll just return the text hi, I guess, that's fine. Then I'm going to get rid of our favicon, going to get rid of the CSS, SVG, and inside of here, all I want to do is just render out our app just like that. And in our app, let's actually do an H1, so we'll say H1 that says hi. There we go. So now we just have our text hi being printed out. We just have a really basic application. Now what I want to do is I want to create one single component that is going to be our select component, and it's going to be able to support multi-select like this, as well as single select all in the same component. And I want it to have a very simple interface where you just have like an on change, a value, and then the options you pass to it. Super straightforward. So let's go ahead and we're going to actually create that component here. I'm going to come over, create a new select.tsx file, and I want to export a function called select just like this. And for our select component, I want to take in a few properties. I want to take in a value. I want to take in an on change for when our value changes, as well as I want to take in the property here for our different options. And I'm just going to set that here to our select props is going to be the type. Now let's create that type right now. We say type select props. And now you may notice I'm missing one property, which is the property to determine if we're going to be using a multiple or single select here. So I want to actually be able to define that later. For now, I just want to start with a single select element, and then we're going to add on multi-select capabilities later, just because it's a lot easier to get something simple started than to try to add both features all at once. So our select props, we're going to have our options, we're going to have our on change, and we're going to have our value. And our options, we're actually going to create another type to support those. So we're just going to call it a select option. And this is just going to have a label, which is a string, and a value, which let's just say it can be, we'll make it a string, yeah. So we'll do a label as a string and a value that is a string. Pretty straightforward. That is an option. For options, it's just going to be an array of those different options. Our value is just going to be a single one of those options, just like this, or it could be undefined. So we could have either an option or undefined. So I'm going to define that as this. We're just going to put a question mark here to say that this is an optional field. We don't have to pass that value in. And then our on change here is going to be a function that passes through a value, and that value can either be an option, and let me just make this singular instead of plural. It can either be an option, or if we don't have a value, it can be undefined. And this is a void function that returns nothing. So that right there is all of our props defined. We have a list of options, we have the currently selected option, as well as the ability to change that option. So then whenever we make changes, we just call that on change function, and in our app, we'll handle that appropriately. Just like you would in normal input. When your value changes, it calls on change, you update the value, and you pass that value back down to your component. That's how our select component is going to work. So now before I get any further with writing out the actual code and logic, the first thing I like to do when I'm writing components is I like to write out the kind of normal HTML structure as well as the CSS for styling this out. So let's do that. We're going to return here And we're going to be returning, return, there we go. We're going to be returning a div, and this div is like the wrapper for our entire component, and that allows us to put everything inside this one div. So we're going to have that div, which is our wrapper, and we're going to give this a class name here, and this class name is going to be our container. But unfortunately, if we just write the class name of container, anywhere else we have the class name of container, we're going to have conflicting styles. I don't like that, so we're going to be using CSS modules for this. So if we create a new file, we're just going to call it select.module.css. Now, whenever we write styles in here, for example, .container, let's just say that background is going to be red, width 100 pixels, height 100 pixels. Let's say that this is what our container looks like. Well, now anywhere we have the container class like this, it's not going to be applied. But if we add another element after this, and we actually import these styles here, so let me just at the top, make sure we import those. Import styles from ./select.module.css. This is going to give us access to all of our styles. So we could set the class name here to be styles.container. And this dot right here is just whatever comes as our class name. So our class name is container, so we just write container right here. So now, if I just give this a quick return here, and I'll just put wrong and right, there we go. And then in our app, if we import that select component, we can actually render it out, and I'll show you exactly what this is doing. Select from ./select, just like that. And this is a named export. There we go. Now here, let's just say we're going to have our select component, close it off like that. And now if we come over here, you can see we have our select component. The one that's labeled wrong has no red background, while the one that's labeled right does. And again, the reason for this is because we're using CSS modules. So all these CSS classes are getting renamed when they're added to our page, and the only way to access them is by specifically accessing the styles we import. For example, if I inspect this, you'll notice that if I just come in here, close out of all this extra stuff, my CSS class is actually called underscore container underscore and a bunch of random text. So it's renaming that CSS style, but my CSS style sheet that we're importing has that name. So that's how it's able to be modularized to only work inside of this one file. Because no matter what, if we add the class container anywhere else, it will not do anything unless we specifically say styles.container. So that's why I really love CSS modules for making components like this where you need CSS. So right here, we have our container. We can get rid of this extra thing. We don't really need that. Next, we're going to need to have our value. So I'm going to put that inside of a span. I'm going to come in the same thing with the class name. And this one's going to be styles.value. And again, we can just use these really generic names because we don't have to worry about conflicts. And for now, inside of here, I'm just going to put value as the text. We can see what that looks like. We have our text value right there. Now, if we just look over here to see what this looks like, you can see we have this clear button as well as this divider icon and then a caret. So we want to add all of those different icons in. So we're going to have a button here. And this button is going to have a class name. And this class name is going to be styles. And this one we want to call the clear button like this, but you can't actually write JavaScript classes or JavaScript properties that have a dash in the middle. So we just need to use the bracket notation. And this is going to be the exact same thing. It's going to access the clear button class information. And inside of here, we want to put the times symbol. That'll give us an X button. So if we look over here, you can now see we have an X inside of a button. Next, we want to have a divider. I'm just going to put that inside of a div. So we'll say div class name is equal to styles.divider. Close that off. It doesn't need any text. We also want our caret. So I want to do the same thing, but we're going to have our caret symbol right here. So that right there covers essentially our entire select. But what happens about the content down here? We have our list of options. So we need to also put that in there as well. I'm going to be using a UL for that. So we're going to come in here with a class name. And this class name is going to be styles.options. That's what we're going to call that. And inside of here, we need to put an li for each one of our different options. So we can just come in here and we can say options.map over each one of our options, just like this. I'm going to use there we go, this kind of syntax, so it'll automatically return for us. And inside of here, we actually need to put each one of our options. So I'm going to use an li for that. Our li is going to have a class name, which is going to be set to styles.option. Close that off. And inside of here, we can put our option.label. And we know we have a value as well, so that can be our key, which will be option.value, just like that. So let's give that a quick save. We're going to come over here, and you'll notice we don't actually have anything on our screen. And if we just inspect, let's see exactly why that is. We look at our console, we're getting some errors. cannot read properties of undefined reading map. And that's because we're not passing any options. So let's pass in some options into here. I'm going to define these options up here. So we can say our options is an array where we have a label, which says first, and a value, which is 1. And actually, I'm going to change my value in here to be any, so that it can be any type at all. It doesn't really matter. And then where we have our key here for our value, I'm actually going to change that to our label. There we go. That should work just fine. Okay, value 1. So then we're just going to copy this down a bunch of times. Second, third, fourth, fifth. I'll just change this to 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we can pass in those options. And now we actually have a list of options showing up. So everything is working just fine. We don't have any errors. Everything is showing up. This is what we want to have happen. Now, obviously, we just need to handle this because right now the CSS is terrible. So inside of our CSS, we want to do the CSS for our container first, and we can kind of look at what that's going to look like. As you can see here, it has this like black-ish outline around everything to make it look more like a select element. And when it's actually selected, you can see it gives us a blue outline instead. Also, you'll notice everything inside of here should scale off of our font size. As our font size increases, our input should get bigger or smaller because of that change in font size. So everything I do, I'm going to be using the EM unit for because that scales off of font size. So first, I'm going to say position relative, and that's just so that we can absolutely position our list of elements after this element. That's all that's there for. We're going to say a width of 20 EM, and again, everything is going to be based on font size, so if our font size increases, our input will increase and everything will look perfect. Our minimum height inside of here, min height, is going to be set to 1.5 EM, and the reason I'm actually setting a minimum height is because if we select enough elements, we want these elements to wrap onto a new line, as you can see here, so we want to make sure that that wrapping is going to happen. And that is why we're setting a minimum height here so that at minimum, it's going to be this height, but if it needs to get bigger, it can with no issue. Also, we're going to set a border, 0.05 EM solid, and we're going to be using this 777 gray color for pretty much everything in our application. That is going to be like our border color. Next, we're going to change the display here to flex because Flexbox is so nice to work with. We're going to align all of our items in the center. And we're going to set a gap of 0.5 EM to space everything out around from each other, and also a padding of 0.5 EM to put some space between the edge of our border and our actual content on the center. Finally, we're going to do a border radius 0.25 EM, and I'm going to remove the default outline because we're going to add our own focus styles. Now, if we come in here, you can see that we have everything being outlined like this. It's spaced out using this gap property and the padding, and it's already looking a little bit better, but still obviously quite cluttered. Also, I want to make it so our container can be focused. So if it's focused, I want to change our border color here to be HSL 200, 100%, and 50%. You'll notice when I click on this div, nothing is happening. And that's because in order to make something able to be focused, we need to give it a tab index. So on our select inside of here, our container right here, we need to give it a tab index of 0. What that's going to do is allow it to be tabbed to in the normal order that it would be tabbed to. So now when I click this, it focuses, and I can actually tab to it by clicking tab, and it's going to tab into that element. Now the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to come over into here where I have my CSS, and I want to select my value element. And this value element, I just want to give it a flex grow of 1. That's just going to make everything else as far to the right as possible, which looks really good. And that's essentially the exact same thing that we have over here. Now with that done, I want to focus on the divider, our caret, as well as this close button. So let's come in here and we're going to do our close button first. The close button is going to have no background, so we're going to get rid of the background. We're going to make the color on it be this 777 color we're using pretty much everywhere. I'm going to remove the border. I'm going to remove the outline. Just everything essentially is going to be removed. I'm going to make it so my cursor is the pointer cursor. I'm going to remove all padding from it. I essentially want it to be as small as possible. And our font size here is going to be 1.25 EM, just so it's a little easier to see. And now if I save that, and I make sure I properly call this clear button, you can see we now have this clear button here. I want to add some styles to it though for when I focus on it. So our focus style, as well as, our clear button dot hover. I want to just make it so that our color is a little bit darker. So we're going to use this 333 color. So now you can see when I hover over this, it gets a little bit darker. Next up, we have our divider, which is going to be very simple. So our divider, we just want it to essentially have a background color to be that same 777 color. And normally you would say, you know, I want our height to be 100%, but it won't actually show up. If we give it a width, for example, you'll see that this element doesn't show up. And that's because we're using a min height here. If we hard code our height, you can see our divider shows up. But since we're using a min height, it doesn't know what 100% height is. So since we're using Flexbox, we can just say we want to align this thing itself in the stretch direction, and now it'll stretch to fill the full height of our container. Obviously, our container is normally not going to be this large, so it won't quite look this ridiculous. But as our container grows, you can see this divider will grow to fill the available space. Next, let's get our little caret symbol. This is, again, a very easy one. What we want to do is we want to get our border. We want to get it 0.25 EM. We want it to be solid, and we want it to be transparent. But our border on the top, we want to have the color, which is that 777 color. This is going to give us this caret symbol here. And to make sure it's positioned in the right space, we can use the translate property to translate it down 25% in the Y direction. And that's going to perfectly center our caret, which looks really good. Now we essentially have our entire style for our select. It looks very similar to this select here, but obviously we have our options showing up in the wrong place. So let's select our different options. Now, first of all, I kind of want to remove all of the default styling on our list. So I can just say here, margin 0, padding 0, list style. I want that to be none. And that's going to get rid of a lot of that default styling that we don't actually want. Also, I want to change the display here to none, but when it's showing, options.show, I want to change the display to block just like this. So by default, we're going to assume that it is showing. So I'm just going to comment this out for now, and then we're going to add that back in so we can actually see what it looks like when we show it and hide it. This is just going to make it easier for us to code our CSS. So first, I want to set a max height. We'll say 15 EM. The main reason for this is if the element has too many items, we want it to scroll. So to make sure it scrolls, we'll say overflow in the Y direction is set to auto. Now, if I add a bunch of elements into our list, let me just come in here and copy this down a bunch of times, hit save, and we'll just do a little bit more. Hit save. You can now see it has reached that 15 EM height. So now we have a scrolling text box, and that is looking much better. That way our select box doesn't get too large. Bring that back to how it was before, back into our CSS here. Next, I want to add a border. I want this to be the same exact border. So we're going to say it's going to be 0.05 EM, solid 777. That's going to give us that little border around it. We also want a border radius, and this is going to be the exact same 0.25 EM border radius that we used all the way at the very top here, just to make it so it matches everything that we're doing. We want to also make sure that we position this in the right location. I'm going to say the width is 100%. I want here the left to be 0. I want to put the top here as a calculation, which is 100% plus 0.25 EM. That's going to give us a little space. We just save this real quick, make sure we position this absolutely. You'll see that it gives us 0.25 EM a space between these. That's what this little plus right here is doing. Without that, we don't have the space. Lastly, what I want to do is I want to add in a background color. Let's do white here and a Z index of 100. This is just going to make sure it shows up over top of everything and nothing shows up through it because it has this white background color. Now we can get rid of that or add in that display none again, so it'll be automatically hidden by default. But if we add in that show class, so if we come in here, and by default we have our option class, and we add in our styles, styles.show, now we save, and we make sure that I actually put this on the right element here. So this should say styles.option. Now it is showing up, which is exactly what we want, and this should say options. So now you can see it showing. If we remove the show, it is now no longer showing. So let's style out our option, our individual options, by just saying option. Each one of our options is going to be pretty straightforward. So we're going to have an option that has a padding here, 0.25 EM, 0.5 EM. That's going to give us some space. And we want to give it a cursor of pointer so we know we can click on them. There we go. That looks really good. The next thing I want to do is I want to have a state for selected as well as highlighted. So we're going to have a highlighted state. This is going to be a background, color here, which is HSL 200, 100%. We're going to use 70% as our lightness. And I want to do the exact same thing, but for our selected element. And our selected element is going to be here with a color of white. And I actually want to swap these. So this one's going to be the selected one. I'll move that up here. And then this will be the highlighted or the selected one. So essentially, whatever one we highlight over, so the one our cursor is over or the one we have our keyboard accessing, is going to be a brighter color. It's going to be more blue. while the one that is currently selected is less blue. If we look over here, you can see all the selected ones kind of have this like lightish blue tone to them, while the one I'm highlighting has this much darker blue. It makes it very easy when you're navigating with the keyboard to know exactly which one you're hovering over, because it's always going to be the brightest blue one that you can see. So now with that done, we essentially have all of our styles done for the single version of our select element, and we'll add in the styles for multi-select when we get to that point, but honestly, there's not too many additional styles we need to do. Let's move over to our select and actually start making it work, because right now it's just a bunch of hard-coded HTML. We'll get rid of this hard-coded code for our value, so it'll just start out blank, and let's actually use our value. So we can say value.label just like this. Now we're going to get an error because we're not passing our value through, so let's pass our value through, and this value is just going to be set to a value variable. So we'll say const value set value is equal to use state, and this use state is going to take in our options, and it's just going to get the very first one. That's going to be our default value. So now if we save, you can see it sets the value to first. If we change this to 1, it's going to change it to our second value, and so on. Also, our onChange, we're just going to pass in here our onChange, which gives us a value. Actually, it's going to technically give us an option, and we're going to set our value to that option, just like that. Now you will notice we're technically getting an error, and it's saying essentially right here that this argument here for set value can either be a select option or undefined, while our set state here can only take in an option. So we just want to make sure we say type of options of 0. That's going to give us the type of this, which is like a label with a value. And then we also want to say or undefined. So all this little bit of code right here is doing is it's saying that our state variable can either be an option like this, or it can be the value of undefined if we have not actually set a value yet. And now we have no more errors in this code. If we come back over here, you're going to see we have an error where it's saying, hey, value is possibly undefined. So I'm just going to put a little question mark in there to make sure it doesn't show a label if we don't have one. So if, for example, we don't pass in any value, you can see that it doesn't show anything and it works without throwing any errors. So now the next thing we probably should handle is the opening and closing of our options. That's one of the most basic things we want to do. So by default, we don't want this to be shown. We only want it to be shown if we have our state variable for isOpen set to true. So we're going to use state. This is by default going to be set to false. And here in our code, we're going to say if isOpen, then we can use the show style. Otherwise, just do an empty style. So by default, it's not showing. But if we change this to true, you can now see that our list is showing. So whenever we have our div being clicked on, we want to make it so that it is shown. So what we can do inside of here is we can say on click, and we can say that we want to set our isOpen. So it's going to be a function that calls set isOpen, takes in the previous value, and gives us the exact opposite of that. So every time I click on it, it's going to toggle between one value and another. So I click, you can see it opens, and it closes just like this. But if I click somewhere off our page, I want to also close it. I'm going to have an on blur event right here, and that's just going to close my thing. So we're going to say, whoops, set isOpen to false. So now if I click off the select element, so if I refresh, click here, click off, you can see we're now calling that blur event, which is closing it. So now we are properly opening and closing anytime we click on it or anytime we click off of it. Now, if we just kind of go down the list of elements, the next thing we should probably make work is the clear button. We should make it clear things out. So on click for this clear event, what we want to do is we want to take in our event element, whoops, event, and we're going to call some code. And inside of here, I'm just going to call a function called clear options, just like that. And we're going to create that function, clear options. And all it's going to do is just going to call onChange and just going to pass in undefined to clear out that value. So now if I save and I click on this clear button, you can see it clears this out. But you'll notice something interesting. When I click on this, it's actually toggling the opening and closing of my select element, which I don't really want. I want it to just clear things and do nothing else. So what we can do is we can call e.stopPropagation, and that's going to stop the click event from going all the way to our parent div, which is going to open it up. So now let's just make it refresh. So we have our element. If I click clear, you're going to notice it does not open our select element. And no matter how many times I click here, it's not opening and closing, which is really good. Now let's do the exact same thing for each one of our li elements. When we click on it, let's select it. So we're going to have just a simple on click here. And inside this on click, we're going to do the same thing where we stop our propagation because we don't want it to go through. Then what we're going to do is we're going to call a function called select option. We're going to pass it in our option, which is coming from right here. And then we're going to set isOpen to false, so it'll automatically close behind. So let's just call this function up here, function select option. We're just going to call onChange with our option. And this option, whoops, this option right here has the type of select option. So now if we just refresh our page here, I click on third, you can see it changed the value to third, or I click on fifth, it changed the value to fifth. Now we need to take into account our highlighting as well as the select highlighting. So if this is the selected one, we want to add some stuff to our class name. So we're going to put this inside of some template strings right here. So we can do really simply, if this is selected, so we can say is option selected. If our option right here is selected, well, then our styles.selected is going to be rendered. Otherwise, we're going to render out an empty string just like this. So let's create that function. Is option selected, taking in a select option. So we can just return option is equal to our value. If they are the same exact element, then it is the currently selected option. So we can scroll back down here, make sure that we have everything closed off properly. This should be right here. And there should be one more of these there. There we go. So now, if I look here, you can see the fifth element is blue because it's selected, second element, fourth element, and so on. Now, in order to give us the highlighting, we can say on mouse enter, and that we can just set to a function here. And this function is going to call set highlighted index. So highlighted index, and that's going to be set to the index that comes from our map here. There we go. And let's make that function now. So all the way up here, function set highlighted index takes in an index, which is a number, and we just want to call that function. But actually, we're not going to use this like this. We're just going to use state for that. So what we'll do is we'll just come up here, highlighted index. Whoops. There we go, highlighted index, and set highlighted index. And by default, we're going to set this to nothing. Actually, we'll just set it to 0 here. So it's going to start out as the very first element. So now what we can do is way down here again, we can do another one of these checks to see if this is the highlighted element. So if our index is equal to the highlighted index, well then let's add the highlighted class onto it. Make sure I spell that properly. So now if I hover over, you can see whatever element I hover has that highlighted class. And by default, we're just highlighting the first one, and that's because when we use arrow keys to navigate with up and down, for example, I want to move this highlighted thing up and down as I navigate between these different elements. You will notice one CSS issue though is our background color is not propagating. So if we go to our CSS and we scroll down to our options, I want to make sure the selected option comes before our highlighted. That way the highlight styles overwrite select, and that looks much better. There we go, back to our select here. There is one other issue you'll notice. Let's say we open this up and we hover over our third element and then we close it. When we reopen it, it's still hovering over the third element when we probably want it to start back at the first. So we're going to use a really simple use effect so that anytime we change our open property, so is open, anytime that is open changes, if we are opening it, I want to change our highlighted index to 0. So every single time we open it, we reset our highlighted index back to 0. So now if I highlight over the third, close it, and open it, it goes back to the first. Now with that out of the way, we essentially have a fully working select box for single select elements. But there's one minor performance thing we can change. If we select the same element again, we probably shouldn't call on change because it technically didn't change. So if our option is equal to our value, or if it's not equal to our value, then we're going to call on change. Otherwise, don't call it at all. And this is just going to save us from calling on change more than we actually need to. Also, I originally changed this value here to any. I'm going to change it to a string or a number, and that way we can actually use our value as a key. So where we're using our label here, I can change this back to a value. That'll just make it so that it should hopefully always be unique because it's a unique value, while the label is not always going to be unique because you could have the same label possibly. So now everything again should still be working, and it looks like it is. So we can move on to actually what's going to happen when we have a multi-select, which adds quite a few extra variables and complexities, especially when we're dealing with TypeScript. So the first thing I want to do is actually deal with our types. So let's add in the prop for multiple here. And what I want to do is I want to have different props for single select versus multi-select, because on a multi-select, our value is an array. Our on change is using an array. So we need to take that into account. So I'm going to have a single select props here, which is just going to be equal to essentially these values. These are the values that are unique to a single select. And this multiple property is going to be set to false, and also it's going to be optional, because if we don't pass in any value for multiple, I want it to default to false. So whether we pass a value in at all, or if the value is false, then we're going to use these properties. Next, I want to use a type for our multiple select. So we're going to have multiple select props here. And this one, our multiple property is required and it must have the value of true. Our value is also required and it's going to be an array of options. So it's either going to be an empty array or an array that has values. And here our value that we pass is always going to be an array. It's either just going to be an empty array or an array with different values inside of it. So now our select props here is a little different. We have our standard options right here, but we also need to add in the properties for our single select and our multi-select. So what this is going to say is it's going to be all the values inside of here. So we can use an and symbol, and it's going to be either our single select props or our multiple select props. So what this line of code is saying is that all of our properties are going to include this options here. And then they're going to either include all the single select props or they're going to include all the multiple select props. And this is going to be determined based on this multiple property. If it's set to true, it's going to use multiple select. Otherwise, if it's false or if it's not given, it's going to be using single select. So now that's going to make it so that pretty much all of our code is going to break because we assume that multiple is always going to be false. But now we need to take into account what happens if it's true. So here's a simple example. If our multiple is true, what do we do for our onChange? Well, we just set it to an empty array when we clear. Otherwise, we just change it to an undefined value. So by changing our code like this, we now are taking into account both values. And since we defined our types up here like this, TypeScript is smart enough to know that onChange here is expecting a single value, while onChange here is expecting an array of values instead of a single value. And that's because we're checking based on this multiple property. That's why we did this multiple true and this multiple false here to make that work. Same thing for when we select an option, we need to be able to do certain code into here. So let's just do that real quick. If we're in the multiple scenario, then we want to do one thing. Otherwise, we're going to do what we were doing before right here. So this code is going to go back to working. And in the multiple scenario, if our value includes our option, well, then we want to unselect it. Essentially, what this is saying is if we've already selected this option before, so like here in our list, if we reselect third, you can see it removes it from the list. So if it's already in the list, well then our onChange should remove that. So it should take in our value and it should filter out the value that currently is in there. Oops. So this takes care of the case where we select the same option, but if we select a new option, we obviously want to add that option. So here, we're just going to take all of our values. We're just going to add the option onto the end of the list. So it's just adding that option on there. Now in the multiple case, when we select a new option, it'll add it. And when we click on it to remove it, it'll remove it. Or if we select it from the list, it will remove it. That's perfect. Obviously, we don't have the code for that yet, but it is going to work. That right there takes care of a lot of our scenarios. Our is option selected obviously needs to change. Even though there's no error, it's technically never going to be correct if we are in multi-select. So I want to be able to change this real quick. So if we are in the multiple scenario, do one thing, otherwise return what we had before. So this should just say value.includes option. So if our value includes it, it is selected. Otherwise, if the value is equal to it in a non-multi-select, it is selected. So now if we just save this and we come back over to here, you can see that right now everything is still working for our single select, which is really good, but we have some errors in our code. And that's because in a multi-select, we can't just print out a single label. We need to print out essentially the card kind of icons that we have right here. So to do that, we're going to have to put in a ternary here. So if multiple, then we need to do one thing. Otherwise, we're going to return this value right here, and which put null inside of here for now. So in a multiple scenario, right now, we're just returning nothing. Otherwise, we'll return this value. So inside of here, let's actually write out the code that we need. And what we need to do is we need to loop through our value because our value is an array. And we're going to get each element from our value, and we're going to return a bunch of information. And I'm going to be returning a button. And that's because we look over here, these are clickable. So I want to be able to use them as buttons so they're as accessible as possible. Now the key here is our v.value. It's just the value for our option. We're going to need to add in an onClick. And this onClick is going to be something that will allow us to remove this element. So come in here, e.stopPropagation, just like we've done on all of our other ones. And then I'm going to call select option with our option. And the reason I'm doing that is because our select option code takes into account the scenario where the option's already selected and it will remove it. So that'll just take care of all of that for us automatically. Now inside of the button, we want to put our label. So we'll say v.label, just like that. And also I want to put a span, which is going to have the class name here, whoops, of styles remove button, and that's going to be for styling out this little X that you can see right here. There we go. Let me make sure I close all of that off. We have our span, which is inside of our button, like that. And it has the @times symbol in it. And let's just save that to get some autocomplete. And then here, I want to add a class name. And this class name is going to be set to styles option badge, just like that. So now if we just come over here and let's change this to multiple. So right now we have some errors going on. Let's see what this error says. Argument of type select value, whoops, is not assignable to the parameter of set action label string value, blah, blah, blah. So this is saying type of option 0 or undefined option 0. That should be fine. Actually, I realize what the error is. The error is because in here, we set our select option to be a string or a number as the type, while here, our select option only has a number as the type. That's why they're not compatible. I'm just going to export this type here so we can use this. I'm just going to say that this is going to be select option, make sure that's imported, and now that's going to fix that error we had. But anyway, let's change this to be a multiple select. Actually, I'm just going to put down a brand new select element. So we're going to change this one to be multiple, and here we're going to have value 1. This will be value 2, value 1, value 2. This is going to be an array of select options, just like that. While this is what it was before, and this will just be an array that has got the first element selected by default. So we have value 1 and value 1, value 1, value 1, and up here this should be value 2 and value, oh no, sorry, this bottom one should be value 2 and value 2. That should hopefully fix the errors that we have. Let's see, we have an error on this one, and it's probably because of, oh, this should be value 2. No, value 1 and value 1. There we go. That fixed all of our errors. So now we have a multi-select and a single select, and let's just come in here with a line break. So essentially all I've done right here is I've just changed around our values. So we have one that is an array, one that's a single element, and we just have two selects being rendered. So now this one, we can select multiple elements. As you can see, it's rendering all those different elements. If we just refresh here, you can see it's working as we would expect. I can click this and it removes them, and then I can add more elements. So it's working. Obviously we need to add the styling though. So let's add the styling for our multi-select section. The first thing we need to do is add some spacing. So up here, I'm going to change our display to flex. I'm going to add a gap of 0.5 EM and a flex wrap, and that is going to be set to wrap. So now it's going to add space, and as we add more and more elements, it's going to wrap them onto the next line if it is needed. Now at the bottom here, let's add some code for that option badge that we created. So for our badge, I'm going to use display of flex because I really like it. We're going to line our items in the center, a border of 0.05 EM solid, and it's going to be that gray color. Everything is going to be based on that gray color. We're going to have a border radius, which is the same border radius we used on everything else, 0.25 EM. Our padding is going to be kind of small because we don't want this to be super big, so we'll do 0.15 and 0.25 EM. Our gap is going to be 0.25 EM. That's spacing out our X from our text because they're very close together. Our cursor should be pointer. We want to remove all the default button styles, so like background should be set to none. And outline should be set to none as well. That right there kind of gives us the styling, works the exact same over here, but obviously we don't have any hover states or anything like that. So option, badge, hover. I want to do the same exact thing on focus. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the background color to be HSL 0, 100%, and 90%. That's going to be a very faint red. And I'm also going to change our border color to be the same thing, but a much redder color. So now when I hover, you can see we get that, and when I tab onto it, you can see we get the same thing. Now, another thing that I want to do is I want to just copy this, paste it down, and I want to select specifically that remove button. So we have our remove button right there. Do the same thing right here. I'll even add the little greater than symbol, so it's only the direct children. And here I want to just change our color to be that dark red color, or that bright red color. So now when I hover, you can see the X turns into that bright red X. Another thing I want to do, I'm going to just copy this down. I want to change the background, the font size to 1.25 EM on our remove button. I also want to change the color here to be 777, and that's only when I'm not hovering. So when I'm not hovering, it's going to be that color. When I hover it, it's going to be the red color, and it's just going to be a slightly larger size with this font size. And with that, you may think that we're done, but we still need to add in keyboard accessibility, which is one of the most important parts of creating a select element. Because this select works fine, like it works beautifully, but it does not respond to any keyboard events at all other than a couple like tab and space events, and that's about it. So let's go and add in the keyboard accessibility. To do that, we need to add a ref to our div. So we can just call this our container ref. And way at the top, we can say const container ref equals use ref. There we go. We also need to give this a type. So this is going to be an HTML div element. And I'm going to default it to null at the start. So here is our ref, and let's make sure we import that. There we go. And now we can essentially create a use effect. And this use effect is going to be something that sets up all of our event listeners. So before I actually set up the dependencies for this, I'm not sure what they're going to be until I write the actual thing. So what we want to do is we want to create a function called handler. And this is a function that takes in our event and it's going to do some code. Then we're going to take our, container ref current. We want to add an event listener, an event listener. This event listener is going to be for the key down event. Anytime we press on a key, I want to run this event, and it's going to run the handler event just like that. Then what I want to do is I want to return a function that is going to remove this event listener. So same exact thing, copy this down, paste it here, remove the event listener, and I want to remove that handler event. So now what we can do here is we can say that this is going to be a keyboard event, and the very first thing I want to check for in here is I want to check for the target of the event. Because if it is not equal to our container ref.current, if our element that we're targeting with our key down event is not the actual container itself, then what I want to do is I just want to return. And that means that if I clicked the plus or down arrow or the space bar on other elements, for example, if I select a couple elements and I tab onto here and I click space bar, that is going to call this event handler even though the target of the event is not the container itself, it's actually the element inside of it. So let's just make sure that our keyboard events only work if we're focused on the select itself and not the things inside of it. Now what I want to do is I want to switch over my e.code, and this is going to give me exactly what key I'm clicking on. So for example, if I say the case of enter, as well as the case of space, all the code inside of here is going to run anytime I click enter or I click space. So what I want to do is I want to toggle the open key. So I can say previous, not previous, and this is going to toggle me between open and closed every time I click space or enter. So if I save, I just tab onto one of these, I click space, you can see it's opening, and I click enter, you can see it is toggling between open and closed. Another thing that I want to do with the open and closed state is I want to always select the option that I'm currently highlighting. So if I am currently open, I want to select the option that is the option at my highlighted index. So now what it's going to do is if I tab onto here, hit space, now you can see that I'm currently highlighted on this fifth element. So when I click space, you can see, let me just refresh this real quick. So if I hit space, I'm highlighted on the first element, hit space again, it should have selected that option, but it did not. The reason for that is because of our dependency array here. When we run this function, it runs and open is currently set to false, but we never re-update our handler when we change our isOpen. So every time our isOpen or our highlighted index changes, I need to rerun this event listener to set it back up again. And also for our options. Those are the three things that we are using inside of this function right here. So now if I tab into this, hit space and hit space again, you can see it is currently selecting and deselecting that element automatically. Now I need to make it so when I click the arrow keys, it moves my highlighted element up and down. So let's come in here and we're going to do a case for our arrow up, as well as a case for arrow down. We'll just come in here with a simple break. So the first thing I want to do is I want to say, hey, if we are not open, then I want to set my open to true. So I want to open it up if we're not currently open, and I want to immediately return from this. So I'm going to call break because I no longer want to be in here. If I click the arrow down, I just wanted to open up the container and it will automatically highlight the first element for me. Otherwise, what I want to do is I want to get the new value that we should be highlighting. And this is equal to our highlighted index plus if our e.code is equal to arrow down, well then what I want to do, is I want to set it here to 1. It's going to add 1 to the value. Otherwise, it's going to subtract 1 to the value. So our new value for our highlighted index is either going to be added or subtracted by 1. And then if our new value is greater than or equal to 0, and our new value is less than options.length, well, in that case, I want to update the value because that means if, for example, we're less than 0 or greater than our options.length, that means we've overflowed and I don't want to move it anymore. So only if we are within those values, then I want to update it. So we can set our highlighted index to our new value. So let's see what that looks like. If I tab into here and click down, you can see that it doesn't do anything. It just opens the container. Then I can click down to move this around. And even if I keep clicking down, you can see it doesn't move me below the last element. Same thing with up, it doesn't move me below or above the top element. Now if I click space, you can see I highlighted fourth. I highlighted third. Let's remove third. Let's remove fourth. Let's remove first. You can see all with keyboard shortcuts, I can do all of that. Now the final keyboard shortcut I want to add is a really simple one. I just want to add the escape key in here. And if I click the escape key, I want to set is open to false and then break. Also, for this arrow up and down, I actually want to wrap this in curly braces, and this may seem really weird because they're not required, but the reason I'm doing that is I'm creating this variable called new value, and I want to make sure it's always scoped within those curly braces and doesn't leak outside of them. That is why I'm doing that. Now, let's make sure this works. I hit escape, and it closes it. That works perfectly fine, just like I would expect. That's all there is to creating a custom React select element. If you want to see how I do this with just plain JavaScript, no React at all, that's going to be linked over here, as well as an advanced React TypeScript project for creating a shopping cart. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.